Welcome to the Monsters Among Us podcast. This is episode 2, season 2, The Phoenix Lights. So, March 13th, 1997. Over Arizona and Nevada, too, something really, really weird happened in the sky.
Yeah, between about, 7:30 and 10:30 p.m. Mountain Time, a whole lot of people saw, well, something. Unidentified flying objects.
And not just in one spot. We're
Yeah.
talking sightings across maybe 300 miles.
That geographical spread is, it's one of the most striking things right off the bat. Nevada down through Phoenix towards Tucson. I mean, a huge area saw something.
Definitely not localized.
Mhm.
And looking at the accounts, you can sort of see two main patterns, maybe events. First, there were all these reports of a huge, dark, triangular or V-shaped thing, silent, just moving.
Right, the formation.
And then later, separate reports, mostly over Phoenix itself, of these really bright lights just hanging there,
Yeah.
stationary, or falling slowly.
And that distinction is crucial, because the explanations or potential explanations might be very different for each.
Exactly. And today, we really want to dig into those accounts that sound like people's direct, firsthand experiences. What did they see?
Those initial eyewitness reports, yeah. Because the official story involves military exercises, Operation Snowbird, A-10s, flares.
Right, which we'll get to. But it doesn't quite seem to cover everything people described, especially early on.
Not easily, no. There's this enduring mystery around it.
Okay, so let's start back at the beginning. Nevada. Around 7:55 p.m. Mountain Time.
Henderson, Nevada. A report comes in.
Yeah.
Large V-shaped object traveling southeast.
Southeast. Okay. Then maybe 20 minutes later, 8.15-ish, down in Arizona near Paulden.
Paulden. An unidentified witness, but apparently a former police officer, described seeing a cluster of lights. Reddish-orange, he said.
And they just disappeared over the southern horizon.
Yeah. And then shortly after that, reports from Prescott Valley, which is nearby, similar lights.
So it sounds like something is definitely moving southeastward across the state.
The trajectory seems pretty consistent in those early reports, yeah. Suggests maybe one object or event seen from different places.
But then we get this really detailed account. Tim Lay and his family, his wife Bobby, son Hal, grandson Damien.
Right. This was also around 8:15 to 8:25 p.m., placing it nicely within that time frame. And they were about, 65 miles southeast of those first Nevada reports?
Yeah. And they first saw 5 lights, separate lights, in an arc shape. They thought maybe, like a balloon rig or something.
But that changed quickly.
Right. They realized the lights were actually moving, coming towards them.
Okay, so what did they see as it got closer?
Well, over about 10 minutes, they watched as these lights approached. And the distance between the lights actually grew. They spread out.
Was spread out into
This definite upside-down V shape. And when it got closer, maybe just a couple of miles off, they described it like a 60-degree carpenter's square,
a carpenter square. That's
Yeah.
incredibly specific.
Isn't it? 5 lights embedded in this shape. 1 at the point, 2 on each side, or arm. It wasn't just some random cluster anymore. It looked structured.
Wow. And how close did they say it got?
They estimated it passed maybe only 100 to 150 feet above them.
100 feet. That's incredibly low for something described as being that large.
And moving slowly. Almost hovering, they said. And the key thing, totally silent.
Silent. That's the detail that always stands out. How does something that large, shaped like that, move so low and slow without making a sound? Conventional aircraft just don't do that.
Exactly. They watched it pass right over them, go through a V in the mountains nearby, heading towards Pistua Peak, and basically towards Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport.
That direction is significant too.
And then there's Kurt Russell.
Ah, yes, the actor, but also an amateur pilot.
Right. He was flying that night and apparently reported seeing the lights to air traffic control, which, coming from a pilot.
It adds weight. Pilots are trained observers. If he saw something unusual enough to report it formally.
It suggests it wasn't easily identifiable as normal air traffic or, weather. Then a bit later, maybe 8:30, 8:45 p.m., people in Glendale, northwest of Phoenix, saw a similar formation.
But they saw it higher up, is that right?
Yeah, high altitude, kind of obscured by thin clouds, they said.
Okay.
But then you have another perspective. Mitch Stanley, an amateur astronomer in Scottsdale, he looked through his telescope.
And what did he see?
High-altitude lights, flying in formation was his description. But he thought they were individual airplanes.
So using a telescope, he resolved them into separate points, which he interpreted as planes flying together.
Right. So even among eyewitnesses to potentially the same thing, you get different interpretations based on, distant equipment, maybe cloud cover.
It really highlights the difficulty, doesn't it? Identifying things at night, miles away. What looks like one solid object to the naked eye might look different under magnification. It's complex.
Definitely. Okay, so that covers those initial formation sightings. But then later in the evening, around 10:00 p.m.
The focus shifts to the Phoenix area specifically.
Yeah, loads of reports suddenly came in about a row of brilliant lights hovering, or maybe falling very slowly.
And these ones,
Yeah.
these were photographed and videotaped, right? We actually have images of this second event.
We do. And this is where the official explanation really kicks in.
Flares, military flares.
Specifically, LUU-2BB illumination flares, dropped by A-10 Thunderbolt II aircraft, Warthogs.
From the Maryland Air National Guard, yeah. They were apparently on a training exercise out at the Barry M. Goldwater Range, which is southwest of Phoenix.
And the Air Force explanation for the apparent hovering was something called a balloon effect.
Right. So these flares burn incredibly brightly and hot. The rising heat basically creates this pocket of hot air that sort of inflates the parachute attached to the flare.
Okay.
And that buoyancy, that lift from the hot air, counteracts gravity enough to slow the descent way down. Makes it look like it's just hanging there for a while.
Until it drifts behind the mountains, people reported them winking out as they went behind the Sierra Estrella Range.
Which fits perfectly with flares descending southwest of the city. And the intense brightness would also, likely wash out any background stars, making the lights seem even more isolated and strange.
And there's confirmation for this, right? It's not just a theory.
Well, pretty solid confirmation, yeah. In 2007, a Maryland ANG pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Ed Jones, actually confirmed he was flying one of the A-10s that dropped flares that specific night.
Oh, okay.
And even before that, a history of the Maryland Air National Guard published back in 2000 specifically mentioned the 104th Fighter Squadron doing that exercise on that date.
And didn't the local paper report on it fairly early?
The Arizona Republic, yeah. They linked the Maryland ANG to the lights back in July 1997, just a few months after the event.
So for those later lights, the 10 p.m. lights over Phoenix, the flare explanation seems, well, pretty well supported.
It lines up quite well. The timing, the location, the appearance, the known military activity.
Yep.
It provides a coherent, conventional explanation for that specific set of sightings.
But then there's the governor, Father Symington III. He was the governor of Arizona at the time.
Ah, yes, Governor Symington. His reaction was interesting.
Initially, he kind of made light of it, didn't he? Held a press conference, had an aide come out dressed in an alien costume,
Yeah.
tried to inject some humor.
He did, tried to calm the public, maybe manage the media frenzy. But years later...
2007 again, actually, same year the pilot came forward. Symington completely changed his tune.
He stated publicly that he himself had witnessed something that night, and he didn't describe flares.
No, he called it an otherworldly spacecraft.
He used words like enormous, bigger than anything I've ever seen, and crucially, he drew on his own experience.
Because he was a pilot too, right? Air Force veteran.
Exactly, an experienced pilot, and he said flat out he couldn't identify it. It wasn't like any aircraft he knew.
And he talked about other responsible people seeing it too and sort of questioned why people who report these things are often ridiculed.
Which is a powerful statement coming from a former governor and a pilot years after the event when he had, less political pressure, perhaps.
It really complicates the narrative, doesn't it? You have this plausible explanation for the 10 p.m. lights.
The flares, yeah.
But Symington's account and all those earlier reports of the silent V-shaped object, they don't seem to fit the flare story at all.
Not neatly, no. Especially the descriptions of the structure, the silence, the very low altitude reported by the Lay family, for instance. Flares dropped miles away at high altitude. Just don't behave like that or look like that up close.
So you're left with two very different types of phenomena reported on the same night.
Pretty much. And the enduring mystery really lies with that first wave of sightings, the massive silent craft, while the flares might explain the second event over Phoenix.
They don't really address that initial widespread V-shaped sighting.
Exactly.
And we should briefly mention there were later incidents, like in 2007, more lights seen.
Turned out to be flares again, that time from F-16's training out of Luke Air Force Base.
And in 2008?
That was apparently a civilian who released helium balloons with flares attached. A hoax, basically.
So these later explained events probably feed into the narrative. People hear lights over Phoenix and immediately think, oh, flares again.
It definitely contributes to the public perception and maybe a tendency to dismiss things too quickly. But it doesn't really take away from the specific, detailed, and still quite puzzling accounts from that night in March 1997.
Okay, so wrapping this up, March 13th, 1997, two main events. This early widespread sighting of a huge, silent V-shaped or triangular object moving across Arizona.
Followed hours later by a series of bright, stationary, or slow-falling lights, specifically over Phoenix.
The official explanation points to military exercises, A-10 aircraft illumination flares, and that seems to fit the later 10 p.m. Phoenix lights quite well.
The numerous eyewitness accounts of that first object, its described shape, its silence, its slow movement, its low altitude, they keep the debate alive. They don't easily match the flare explanation.
And then you have Governor Symington, an experienced pilot, eventually claiming he also saw something truly inexplicable, something otherworldly, adding a whole other layer of intrigue.
It leaves us with a fascinating puzzle. A well-documented event, or maybe two events, that still, after all this time, resists a single, simple explanation that satisfies everyone who looked up that night.
That is the end of this episode. Until next time. Keep to the shadows. Some legends are best left undiscovered.